Welcome back, everybody, to Dungeon Brew. John and I are continuing our series talking about different genres that you may explore as a dungeon master or game master. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
Welcome back, everybody. Today on Dungeon Brew, John and I are going to be talking about high fantasy. We are continuing our series looking at different genres that one might explore when building their gaming world and how those differ from other fantasy genres. And again, today is high fantasy. John, why don't you start us off by giving a definition of what high fantasy is?
I think it's going to be helpful maybe because we've already covered epic fantasy, and a lot of times epic fantasy and high fantasy are seen as the same thing. And traditionally, if you look at this is how most other people are probably going to approach it, as epic and high are kind of one and the same. We're differentiating a little bit because we really wanted to talk about how high fantasy is kind of its own thing, because you could have an epic low fantasy, for instance, or an epic high fantasy, or an epic whatever. Epic can be a descriptor of these other ones. But as far as high fantasy is concerned, when we're talking about high fantasy during this video, we are talking about primarily like the ecology that exists within a world. We're talking about creatures, we're talking about flora, we're talking about different things that are a part of the world that are considered to be fantastical or mythological, that are getting thrown in as part of the normal world, versus what might be considered low fantasy, which would be a lack of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. When I think of high fantasy, it's really saying that you have fantastical elements that are the staple of the world. The world would seem bizarre without it being included within that world. It would be like us saying that the Greeks never existed, or in a fantastical world saying that elves never existed. It's like taking a population and just removing it and going, what in the world does that mean if they don't exist anymore? Because it's so natural or normal to have them be there.
Right, and I mean, talking about something like elves, that is considered a fantastical element. This is why Tolkien's works are generally considered to be a high fantasy. I mean, they're also epic, but they're high fantasy because dwarves are normal, hobbits are normal, elves are normal, you have Ents in the world, there are dragons. All of these fantastical creatures are part of the natural order, and it's not surprising to the vast majority of the people who exist in that world that those things are true. You do have certain cultures that are a little bit more far removed, so the hobbits kind of don't really see much beyond the bounds, and so they don't really know what's going on, or they may be, oh, dragons aren't real, Bilbo's cracked. Mm-hmm. That is different than those things actually being true and part of the world.
Yeah, I agree. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is like the best example for me to like step in from a normal world into a high fantasy world, because you have these kids that come in there and then they're like, oh my god, did you guys know the beavers can talk? And the people of the world are like, you think the beavers say some shit? Wait till you hear the badgers. Like, it doesn't even faze them in the slightest, but the people that stepped into that are just blown away.
Right, and it's a portal fantasy, but at the same time, it is high fantasy. And this is something that you and I have talked about in our world building, where you talk about something like military and warfare. Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe and that entire series by C.S. Lewis is an excellent example of what that type of warfare would look like, where you could just have this menagerie of fantastical creatures engaging in a battle, both for good and for evil, you know. But you have all of them fielded versus something like low fantasy, where it's like you would have humans. It's like that is the military that's being fielded, is the traditional type of humanoid army that you would expect to see in our own world, versus high fantasy where you have minotaurs and dragons and bears and lions and all kinds of stuff like that.
So let's talk a little bit about how a DM then needs to approach this world building aspect in a high fantasy setting, because you're still looking at the same elements that you and I talked about during the world building phase, but you have to look at them a little bit differently. Like on the top of my head, I'm thinking of politics. Politics are now an interwoven historical piece that has always existed between different fantastical races that exist throughout the world, whether it's a minotaur race or orcs or elves or dwarves. They have treaties that have been signed, wars that have been fought, developments that have been made between all these different peoples that have existed. Now, as a DM, you have the ability to throw some tropes on their head to kind of make it interesting and unique in the way that you're presenting that to your characters.
Right.
But you have to realize that this is going to probably have some historical aspects of how politics have been ran, and there may be specific laws and governance within the city on how each of these different types of races are handled or engaged with based on the region or the realm that you are traveling through.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely there is more of a sense, most likely, in a world like this, and this is true in a lot of fantasy books that you read. You know, the traditional elf-dwarf hatred dynamic that is a very much a trope. That type of thing can be that type of thing can exist between multiple creatures or races or species or however you want to attribute those things, but it becomes a thing where you suddenly are looking at other creatures as other creatures versus our own world where it's superficial, pretty much.
Yeah.
There are actual differences between many of these types of things. Talking about something like longevity. So you're talking about politics. How does a humanoid culture or a humanoid government maintain some kind of treaty with an elven government that exists for hundreds, if not thousands of years underneath one ruler because they simply live that long, whereas the humanoids the human race has gone through a dozen different leaders and different, their politics have changed multiple times. How do you represent that type of interaction between those two peoples? Because it would be very different than our own world where, a treaty or some kind of alliance or something like that might exist for decades. And that's considered long. For elves, it's like, that's considered just like a snap of the fingers. It's like, we have a treaty. It's been here for 50 years, but that's nothing. You guys are already breaking it with us, or you've changed your leader 3 times. What's going on here?
I know that there's a lot of modern authors that have done well in exploring this, like in books. We even see this in other types of media pieces, but I think Tolkien, because we're both familiar with him, kind of fall back as being the example that's presented. But he does very well in doing this and showing the differences in these cultures, their interactions with each other, and how much of it is known in adjacent cultures that are bordering against their realms. Because you're going to know that when I walk through the Elven realms, this is the way that I should be handling things. Or if I'm walking through the Dwarven realms, this is how I should be handling things. And he allows that contrast to exist and for people to be aware of those things to be incorporated. And so if you're running a campaign, I guess in my long rambling here, is that you probably are going to have some knowledge checks for your characters, or you as the DM are going to present that information freely to them. You may not need to roll that history check or a religion check on certain elements that are just known in the world because they exist in the world, and it's so natural to have that.
Yeah, and that actually makes me think of something else that's very interesting in this regard, which is that, particularly because you brought up Tolkien, and we talk about Tolkien so much on this channel, but when you talk about Tolkien and you think about the amount of influence that the Elven culture has had on Gondor, for instance, right? The civilization that Gondor is so heavily influenced by Elven culture that it is integrated into them. Almost the same way that we would say something like Greek or Roman culture has been integrated into the vast majority of the cultures in Europe and America, just in the sense that those cultures are long-lasting, they had huge influence, and it still impacts us today, thousands of years later. Then you have cultures in that world in which the elves don't necessarily interact with other people. Because for them, again, 50 years is not a very long time. So it's entirely possible that there are people that exist in the world that have never seen an elf, never talked to an elf, have no idea what they look like, and for all of their intent and purpose, they're a myth. They're not real, because it's like, I've never seen an elf in my lifetime, because the elves don't have a reason to necessarily leave their lands. And so it's like, they haven't visited a human land in a century or 2 centuries because they have no reason to, which makes them slip into that era of myth and legend, because who's talked to one? Nobody.
Yeah, I really like that conceptualization. That's nice. I'm trying to think of other things. I don't mean to just flip the thing, but I know we're running short on time on how long we want to do each one of these. And I know there's a lot more different elements in high fantasy to look at. One of them that I also think of is economy. specifically because I think that you have to look at economy differently when you have fantastical races that are spread throughout the realms and known about. I mean, if you have folks that are like Ents that are looking over the woods, then you might have to consider that before you're getting lumber and passing it about. If you're going out and you are killing deer or fowl or something else within a region, and you have a green man or something that shepherds them and takes care of them, then you have to consider that when you are upsetting the world, by going and taking out these animals and utilizing them in order to feed your people. And then, of course, you have your regular fantastical races, too, that you might have, whether it's the dwarves or the elves or whoever, that are, what does trade routes look like and how does that impact economy? What type of negotiations are done or are gone as a result of warring that is impacting that, too, and impacting the folks that are on their quest lines?
Well, and the thing is, when you're thinking about high fantasy kind of is the default anyway. It's very easy to look at existing publications, especially for Dungeons and Dragons. Things like Forgotten Realms is high fantasy, Dragonlance is high fantasy, Tolkien is high fantasy, C.S. Lewis is high fantasy. These things are high fantasy. They default to the existence of certain creatures and certain cultures that are a part of the world. They're integrated. If you run a D&D campaign and you don't have a dragon, it seems strange. Like, it doesn't feel like a real game to certain people because that is interwoven into a high fantasy world. It gets different when you start looking at low fantasy. And we've talked about this before, but there's definitely a scale that exists here where you go from very high fantasy where you have the C.S. Lewis style military, or you have the Forgotten Realms style tavern that's just filled with a menagerie of dragonborn and tieflings and Asimar and all these strange and unique creatures, and that is very high fantasy. And then you start going towards low fantasy, where it's like there are humans and nothing else, and everything has to deal with just humans, and we're just playing in this historical fiction style world in which those things are true. And you can have anything in between. It's really up to the dungeon master, the game master, to make the decision on kind of where those things fall in. And even though we've talked about Tolkien as being a high fantasy, realistically, it's like there are much higher fantasies, especially when you start talking about things like Forgotten Realms and Dragonlance, where suddenly there are new species and new cultures, and the existence of entire flights of dragons that have wars in the sky overhead and that type of thing is much different than Tolkien, where it's like there's one dragon left and he just got killed not that like 80 years ago. There aren't any more that exist in the world.
Yeah. Trying to think what else to add here, John. I agree with you, and I love that, again, that presentation of that information. Are there other areas that you want to explore with high fantasy and how that may differ? Because I want to make sure we're not getting too much into low fantasy, since we'll be talking about that in our next video.
Yeah, and I think we can dive deeply into low fantasy in the next one. I just wanted to make sure that that representation of high fantasy is clearly felt, just in the sense of what are the possibilities. Because it's the default, I think that it's easier to approach high fantasy than it is something like low fantasy. I think that it makes it more of an expectation oftentimes, and you can get away with running a game in which high fantasy is assumed. It's a little bit more difficult to set up a low fantasy campaign, but we'll talk about that next time.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think the piece with this, as you have illustrated a couple of times now, is that if you are going to be running high fantasy, because it is something that a lot of your players are going to expect stepping in, just see how you can flip some of those tropes on their heads.
Yes.
How can you challenge those tropes and make it engaging and challenging, so that you're not just walking in and oh, well, dwarves always hate elves, and that's just what the rule is going to be. Add a little bit more complexity to your world so that your players are excited and engaged in a different way than maybe just stepping into something that, I don't know, it's almost stereotypical in nature.
Yeah, and you can mix and match high fantasy with other types of fantasy. Epic fantasy, like I said at the beginning of the video, is sometimes seen as the same as high fantasy, but you can have epic low fantasy, but you can also have epic high fantasy. You can have high dark fantasy. You can have high, what was one of the other ones that we were doing? But high magic or a high fantasy is something that really lends itself well to a variety of other genres, and mixing and matching those is a good way to turn some of those tropes on their head, particularly for something like high dark fantasy. You can go into a high fantasy or high heroic fantasy, and people are assuming that they're going to be the heroes and everything's going to be hunky-dory, but you go high dark fantasy and many of those tropes start getting flipped. You have elven cannibals, you have dwarven mercenaries who are just going around and selling their services to the highest bidder and that type of thing, and it makes the world feel different while still being high fantasy.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you everyone for hanging out with us again here on Dungeon Brew, and we will see you next week. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button.
Dungeon Brew.